In this lecture, I'll cover three distinct foreign policy periods during the Mao years that reflect China's shifting assessment of the international environment from 1949 to 1978. After the founding of the People's Republic, the Chinese leadership was focused on consolidating power, ensuring national security, and developing the economy. Mao issued an assessment that the overriding trend in the world was toward conflict and revolution, and that China would oppose imperialist aggression. Because the Soviet Union had supported the CCP in the Civil War and controlled the Comintern, an international communist organization that enjoyed increasing influence in China, Mao Zedong in mid-1949 declared that China would, quote, lean to one side, meaning toward the international communist movement. In 1950, Mao went to Moscow to negotiate the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. Under this agreement, China gave the Soviet Union certain rights, such as the continued use of a naval base at Port Arthur, now Dalian, on the southern tip of Liaoning province, which Moscow used until 1955. China received military support, weapons, and large amounts of economic and technological assistance, including technical advisors and machinery. China acknowledged Soviet leadership of the international communist movement and adopted the USSR's approach to development, abundantly evident in urban architecture that survives from this period. At Stalin's urging, China intervened in the Korean War and battled the U.S. to a standstill at the cost of over 200,000 Chinese soldiers. This action strengthened the Sino-Soviet relationship and for a time appeared to unite Moscow and Beijing. Nevertheless, Chinese participation in the Korean War frustrated its own efforts at reunification. In January 1950, U.S. President Truman had declared that the U.S. would not intervene if China attacked Taiwan. But in June, he reversed that stance and ordered the 7th Fleet to police the Taiwan Strait to prevent a PRC attack. During this period, the Chinese also promulgated the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence, formally put forward in negotiations with India in 1954, in an ultimately unsuccessful attempt to resolve the country's border dispute. The principles include mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. These principles represented China's full embrace of the Westphalian nation-state model and continue today as the proclaimed bedrock of Chinese foreign policy. The problem of the lean-to-one-side approach was that China became heavily dependent and heavily indebted to the Soviet Union. This foreign policy failed to meet the Chinese yearning to fully throw off the yoke of foreign control. During the second half of the 1950s, strains began to emerge between China and the Soviet Union. Chinese leaders were disturbed by Soviet revisionism under Nikita Khrushchev, which included de-Stalinization and a move towards peaceful coexistence with the West. Mao was in favor of a more militant policy against the West and felt that the communist world should press its perceived advantage, even at a time when Moscow was in favor of a more conciliatory policy. By the end of the 1950s, China had struck out on its own and adopted an anti-U.S., anti-Soviet strategy officially called the Two Fists strategy, essentially a pox on both your houses. China, to the extent it had a foreign policy during this time, focused on developing countries, or South-South cooperation. This was highlighted by Premier Zhou Enlai's participation in the 1955 Bandung Conference, which gave rise to the non-aligned movement. Literally, the most important foreign bilateral relationship China had in the 1960s was with Albania. In 1956, Mao also launched China's effort to acquire nuclear weapons. During a Politburo session, he said, "Now, we're already stronger than we were in the past, and in the future we'll be even stronger than now. Not only are we going to have more airplanes and artillery, but also the atomic bomb. In today's world, if we don't want to be bullied, we have to have this thing." Note the concern about being bullied, a vestige of China's recent experience at the time. China essentially became an isolated rogue state, much like North Korea today, and alarmed the world with its WMD development programs, including its first atomic bomb test in 1964, surface-to-surface missile test in 1966, hydrogen bomb test in 1967, and launch of a satellite in 1970. The CIA captured the triumphant mood in China after it successfully exploded an atomic bomb in a since declassified article in the President's Daily Brief, or PDB, that noted, quote, The successful atmospheric test at the Lop Nur site has doubtless added to the already monumental self-regard of the Chinese leadership." End quote. As an aside, I love this wording. During my career, our language tended to be more staid and measured. Using a phrase such as, quote, "already monumental self-regard," end quote, captures the attitude of the Chinese leadership perfectly, but probably would have been considered too scathing or flowery for the editors in my day. China also got involved into a month-long border war with India in 1962, and a series of border tensions with the Soviet Union that ultimately resulted in the bloody skirmish at Junbao Island in 1969. The Two Fists policy was a disaster for the PRC. China had almost no friends, with the exception of the aforementioned Albania and Pakistan by virtue of a collective disdain for India. This isolation accompanied serious economic stagnation and unrest at home with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Although this external bellicosity may have been satisfying for a populace that was tired of being pushed around by foreign powers, it came at a great cost. China's weakness and rogue status did not satisfy China's desire to be powerful and respected. A CIA assessment from 1966 sums this period up nicely. Quote, "The men who control China's destiny are acutely conscious of their Chinese heritage. This means they are quite sure of their own superiority and their duty to gain redress for the humiliation China has suffered at the hands of foreigners. They are ambitious to make China a world power, yet they command a weak base. This has led them to try too much too soon, sometimes with painful results. They see themselves as virtually alone in a hostile world. This has created a siege mentality." The Junbao Island clash was the final straw in what turned a strained Sino-Soviet relationship into an antagonistic one. Chinese leaders began to consider joining with the United States to oppose the Soviet Union, a strategy that became known as One United Front. In principle, the idea is to join with one enemy to confront a larger enemy, similar to the 1930s when the CCP and KMT joined forces to fight the Japanese. In October 1970, Mao invited American journalist Edgar Snow to China and told him that China should now place its hope on the American people. An opportunity to start the thaw was presented at the April 1971 World Ping Pong Championships held in Nagoya, Japan. Glenn Cowan, a player on the U.S. team, missed his shuttle from the venue back to the living quarters for the athletes and hopped on the shuttle for the Chinese players. During the 15-minute ride, he struck up a conversation with three-time world champion Zhuang Zedong, no relation to Mao, as Chinese surnames come first, and they exchanged gifts. The press took notice, and Mao parlayed the publicity over the goodwill to invite the U.S. team to visit China. So after the championships, the U.S. team went to China for a week of exhibition matches and also got a tour of the Summer Palace and the Forbidden City and enjoyed a ballet performance. There were rumors in China that Mao instructed the Chinese players to lose most of the matches in order to make the U.S. public feel better about the visit. As a side note, I got the chance to play ping pong with Zhuang Zedong in 2007. Even at age 67, he absolutely toyed with me. Anyway, this opening was shortly followed by a secret trip by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger in July 1971, which paved the way for the PRC to replace the ROC, Taiwan, on the UN Security Council in November 1971 as a permanent member with veto power. In fact, shortly after China returned to the UN, there was a significant shift in diplomatic recognition from the ROC to the PRC, essentially the turning point in China's battle with Taiwan for diplomatic recognition. These actions led to President Nixon's visit to China in February 1972, to date probably still the most famous foreign visit of a U.S. president. The most significant diplomatic achievement of the Nixon visit was the signing of the Shanghai Communique, which skillfully set aside the Taiwan question and started China and the United States on a pathway to normalization, which took place on January 1, 1979. China also normalized relations with Japan in 1972 and agreed to set aside the question of war reparations and territorial disputes. The United Front strategy was temporary and transactional. It's significant because it demonstrated the evolution of China from seeing itself as a special case to one that was willing to take its place on equal footing with other nations of the world and begin to behave more as a normal country. It also laid the groundwork for much more consequential policies that would be enacted by Deng Xiaoping, which we'll cover in the next lecture.